So in this video, we create this multi-user real-time chat system. But before we get there, I just want to say thank you, Brad, for the opportunity to connect with your audience. I think it's really great that you're giving smaller YouTubers this opportunity. Okay, my name is Jack Herrington. I YouTube as the Blue Collar Coder, and I cover front-end topics all the way from kind of basic to intermediate to advanced examples like this multi-user chat system that uses GraphQL Subscriptions, Websockets, and eventually a new feature called Module Federation that's built into Webpack 5. It's really cool. If you haven't heard of that, I think you're going to want to stick around for that. Okay, so how are we going to do it? So step one, we're going to go build out our GraphQL server. It's going to be pretty simple, just reading and writing messages. Then we'll use, in step two, Apollo Client to go and build out a React app that uses polling to connect to that server, and that's not particularly efficient. So we're going to go back in step three to the server and upgrade it to a subscriptions model. And then in step four, we'll go and upgrade the client to use those subscriptions. And then you're going to do in step five something really cool and share that chat component to another application live using Webpack 5's Module Federation feature. It's really cool. But I've talked enough, so let's just go jump into the code. All right, so here's our app that we're going to build. And it's actually side by side. We're showing two versions of it, localhost 8080 on both sides. And it's basically a chat window. It's got the chat list at the top, and then it's got a 3-column section down below. The first column has who you are, and you get to just define that on the fly, and the message you want to send, and an send button. Although you can hit return just to make it easy. And you can see immediately, I click send, and boom, it's over in the other window. No problem. And I can add a third person to the party down here. I'll add Joe. And you can see when I type in Joe, it says, well, you're not in the conversation yet. So all of the other messages, which are from Jack and Mary, go on the right-hand side. And then anything I type in is going to go on the left-hand side. All right, looking pretty good. So what we're going to use for this is we're going to use GraphQL. And to make that easy on ourselves, we're going to use a starter kit called GraphQL Yoga. So let's go build that server. So I'm going to create a new directory called Chatomatic. It's going to have, well, 3 projects in it, but we're going to start with server. And we're going to init that package JSON and then add in GraphQL Yoga. Okay, looking pretty good. Let's go check out that package JSON and go create a script that's going to start our server. And we're going to create a new file called server.js. And into that, we're going to bring in GraphQL Yoga. And from that, we're going to bring in GraphQL Server. Let's go create it. And then we'll call a method on it called start. And start is going to take a function, which is callback. And part of that is the port. So that's going to tell us what port it started up on. And we'll just console log that out. Server started up on HP localhost, make that template string. Okay, looking pretty good. Now, every GraphQL server needs types. It's got a schema. So the first thing we need to do is define what a message looks like. And the way that we do that is by saying type message, and then in curly braces we put in the different fields that are within message. The first one's going to be the ID. It's going to be unique ascending ID. And there's a special type for IDs, capital I, capital D. And then if I put an exclamation mark, that tells me that the field is required. So this is saying that I have an ID that's required. And then I've got a user, which is a string, which is required, and then content, which is also a string. Now, how do I get these messages? Well, I've got to have a query type. So I create a query type that has within it a key for messages. And that's going to return an array of messages. And that's signified by those square brackets. And I'll add that into the GraphQL server definition by saying that that's our type defs, and giving it the same name so make it easy on ourselves. And then we're going to give it a set of resolvers as well. So this is basically saying, okay, now you got your types. Now, how do I actually get the data? And that is done using resolvers. And the resolvers kind of match the keys that are in the type definitions. So in this case, we've got a query. And then within that, we've got those messages. So a resolver is a function, and in this case, it's got to return an array. So, well, let's go make a new array called messages. And then we add those resolvers to the GraphQL server. So now we've got the types and how to go get them all set up. So let's start our server. And here's a really cool thing about, well, most GraphQL servers, but GraphQL Yoga as well. They have this Graphyql interface built right in, so we can start playing with it right away. So I bring it up, and if I'm not making a request from like a fetch, I get this cool Graphyql UI. So let's go make our first query, and the syntax for that looks like this. You just give it a query, you say I want messages, you give it the fields that you want, and then you execute it. In this case, it's not too exciting, right? We don't have anything in messages. So we have to go create a mutation. Now, a mutation is essentially like, post in the REST world. And what do we want to do with this? We want to post a message, a new message. So we're going to say that post message will take a user as a string. Is required, thus the exclamation point, and also the content. And it's going to return an ID. What ID was created from this new message. It could return anything. It could return the message. It's whatever you want. And we've got to go add a resolver for that. So in this case, we're going to say that it's a mutation. And it's post message. And now that function actually does, in every case, take a bunch of arguments. And the first one is the parent, which would be whatever the container is. In this case, that's not going to be anything. It's just the root of the tree, which is empty. But it also takes arguments, which in this case is user and content. And then we're going to go get the ID, which is just the length of the array. And then we're going to go push that content, the ID, the user, and the content into the array, and then return that ID. All right, let's restart that server because we're not going to pick up those changes until we restart the server. And we can rerun the same query, but we'll find, again, an empty array. So let's make a new tab here and say that we have, in this case, a mutation. It's not a query. In this case, we want to do the mutation. And we'll say that we want to post that message. We give it a user of Jack and a content of hello. Great. And it looks like it was successful. It returned a 0, which was the size of the array, which is the new ID then. And we'll go add another message. Goodbye. Okay, now we get a post message return of 1. And let's go back over to messages. Hit play again. Oh, awesome. Okay, this is really cool. So just in the first few minutes here, now we've got a working GraphQL server that supports a schema that you can now request data from and also add data to dynamically. It's pretty exciting. Okay, we've got our GraphQL server running. It wasn't that hard, which is great. So the next thing to do is to go build a UI based on that. So we're going to use a component library called Shards. It's new, it's pretty cool, it's lightweight. And we're going to use Apollo Client to go and connect to the server. Let's go try it out in the code. But this isn't a great UI. Obviously, we want to go and create our chat UI to go on top of the service that we just created. So I'm going to use a starter kit that I built. It's kind of like a pared down Create React app. All it's got is just React and Babel, but it is based on Webpack 5, which is important because at the end of this video, we're going to use an exciting new feature in Webpack 5 called Module Federation. I'm going to go create another terminal window in my VS Code, and I'm going to go back up a directory and do npx dget and then give it the URL of that project. And dget does this really nice thing. It basically just does a git clone, and then it removes the git directory. It's a dgetter, but it's really nice. Very convenient way to start up a project. And we'll do that off the main branch. And then we'll call this new project client. It's our chat client. All right, let's go close a few windows here and then start taking a look around at what client is. So let's go take a look at our Webpack config for this project. You can see that it's fired up on 8080. All it really does is apply Babel to our JS and then bring in any CSS we want using a style loader. And then there's also this Module Federation plugin that we'll get to in a bit. And then the HTML Webpack plugin, which basically gives us our index page. Okay, let's go take a look over the code. We got an index.js, which is the booter. It's just going to import the app file. Got some pretty simple CSS. And then we've got our app. And it just basically imports React and React DOM, brings in that CSS, creates a really simple component called app, and uses React DOM render with that app component to render it into a div with the ID of app in our index page. Okay, let's start that up. Hey, it looks pretty great. Okay. A good starting point for us. So for our UI toolkit, we're going to use a new one called Shards, very lightweight framework. So let's bring that in. And we'll also import some CSS to support that. I think it uses Bootstrap CSS. Kind of, all right, then, sure. And then to manage our connection with the GraphQL server that we just built, we're going to bring in Apollo Client. So I'm over here in the Apollo Client docs, and all that is in the description, by the way. So just check out the links in the description, and all of these links are in there for all of this. So let's go and follow their instructions to install it. We'll just bring in Apollo Client and GraphQL. And just to make sure everything's cool, we'll just fire that up again. Looking pretty good. Great. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to go and first connect to the GraphQL server. So we need to create a client for that. So we'll scroll down a little bit. We'll grab this code for creating a client. And you're going to paste that into a new file called chat.jsx. So this is going to be our chat widget. The app's job is basically to render that chat widget onto the page. The chat widget itself is going to be in this new file. And we'll change out that URI for that Apollo client so that it points to our GraphQL server. And now the next thing we need to do is we need to provide that as context to any components inside of our app. So we'll go and bring in the Apollo provider. And this is, if you're familiar with Redux, this is very similar to that. There's a Redux provider that provides that state down in the tree. So we'll create a chat component, and then we'll wrap that in an Apollo provider where we give it the client as a property. So now let's go import that into our app. And now we get a very, very small I'm a chat window. That just means that we're running, everything's cool, there's nothing's exploding yet, but we actually haven't done anything. We really haven't made any requests to our GraphQL server, so that's what we need to do next. So how do we do that? Well, let's go over here. So let's go down to requesting data. And we're kind of following along with some of the documentation here. It's a really nice, well-documented site for Apollo client. Pretty much everything Apollo, really. And so what we need to do is also bring in use query and GQL from Apollo client. Now, GQL is this handy little helper function, which basically manages string templates that are filled with the GraphQL query language code. So we'll create a new constant called getMessages, and we'll wrap that in one of these GQL templates. And we're just going to go back and we're going to go grab the code that we did, right? We have this nice query. Let's reuse that. So we'll go grab the query from 4000. Drop that in there. Nice, looking pretty good. And now we just got to run it, right? So we're going to create a new component called messages. That's going to be our display of messages. And it's going to take a property called user. And user is going to be who our current user is. So that's going to allow us to show on the left-hand side if it's not my messages, and then on the right-hand side if those are messages that I created. But really the important part is let's go make that query. So we're going to go use that use query hook, and it's going to give us back data. It actually gives us back a lot of things, but I'm just going to use data in this case. And then we give it that get messages query. We're going to say we don't have any data, then we haven't done anything yet. We haven't made the query, so we're going to just return null. But if we have, then let's just return the JSON stringified payload, right? What do we get back? Hey, okay, that looks pretty good. So that is the return from the server. So we're actually making the request, and we're getting back the data, and then we're putting it on the page. Really cool. If we're going to go see that we're making the request, we can go over here to our network inspector panel, and we can see that we're making a request to 4,000. We see the request going out and the data getting back, and it's great. It doesn't look so good, though. I don't think anybody wants to use JSON as a UI, so let's go and bring in some components from that shards React library that we brought in. So the first one I'm going to bring in is container, and then we're going to wrap the page effectively in that, and that's going to basically just kind of center everything. And now for the messages, we're just going to go map through each one of those. And each one has an ID, a user, and some content. And then we're going to start styling some stuff. So every row of this thing is going to be a flex box. And then we're going to decide whether we want to justify it to the left, where if it's not me, or to the right, if it is me. But of course, we have two users now. We got the user from the property, and we got the user from the actual message itself. So we need to disambiguate those. So we'll map user to message user. And where they match, meaning this is a message from me, we're going to justify it as flex end, which puts it over on the right-hand side. And if it's not me, we're going to use flex start, which puts it over on the left-hand side. Add a little padding to the bottom. And now we'll create the content div. So that's going to have the message body itself. And we'll make that pretty. We'll give it a background, where the background is kind of a greenish thing if it's me, or a grayish thing if it's somebody else. And then for the font color, we're going to use white for me and then black for anyone else. And that's going to give us a nice contrast. And we'll put a little padding on it, give it a nice border radius to make it roundy. And we're going to say that our max width is 60%, right? So that means that there's going to be a little overlap. If you get really long messages, it's going to overlap in the middle. It's going to look really nice. This is going to look nice. All right, let's go take a look. Oh, it's looking good already. That is pretty. So let's see if that message user logic passes by just changing out the username. So in this case, I'll change the user to Mary, which is not the person who sent those messages. And it shows now, if I Mary, now Jack's messages show up on the right-hand side. So this looks good. But we're missing that little circle-y thingy in there. So let's go make that. And we're going to say, if I'm not who sent the message, and we're going to put in the circle by creating a new div in here. And it's got the username. We're just going to slice off the first two letters out of that and then uppercase it. And we'll make it a 50 by 50 circle with a little bit of margining on the right-hand side just to move it away from the message. All right, now put a little 2-pixel solid border around it. And give it a border radius of 25. That's going to make it a circle because the width and height are 50. We'll align the text in the center, and we'll give it a nice big font size. Let's take a look. Looking pretty good. It's up a little bit, so let's go and add a little bit of padding on that. Oh, that looks really nice. Okay. So the next thing we need to be able to do is post a message to this thing. So we need some UI for that. So we need a row and a column. We're going to use that for layout. And then we need the form input, which is the input field, and a button for that send button. And we're just going to manage this out of chat. So we're going to create some state. We're going to use good old-fashioned React use state for this. And we're going to say that the user is, well, me, and the content is nothing. And now that we have a state and we know what the user is, let's go and set that user from the hard-coded Mary to the state user. And now let's create a row where we've got 3 columns in it, where the first one is going to be a size of 2 out of 12 and have no padding. And then within that, we're going to have a form input field. Have a label of user, a value, and then have the value, which is the user key within state. And then in onChange, we have a callback that takes an event and then calls state set to go and reset the state to have the current state where the user is set to the current target value on that event, which is essentially the value of that form input. Okay, that looks pretty good. So we need to do almost exactly the same thing for the message. We'll go and change out the sizing a little bit. Make that 8 wide out of 12. I guess that's what, 3/4? And the content. And we'll then change the state set. Looks good. Now let's try this out. All right, looking pretty good. And I notice now when I change out the user, it kind of flips immediately from side to side. So I'm at Jack and I change that out. Boom, it goes over the other side. Really great. All right, the last thing I need is a button to send it. And we'll just call some onSend function that we're going to go create. So we're going to also make it easy on ourselves. We're going to handle somebody hitting return in the content form field. And that just means we need to look at the key up. And then if within that, the event has a key code of 13, which is return, we're going to call that onSend function. So let's go and make that onSend function. First thing we need to do, hey, if we don't have any length in the content, then don't send anything. Come on, no blank messages. So then once we've sent it, we're going to go and reset the content to blank. That's a nice thing to do, right? So how do we go and run a mutation? So let's go over to our handy Apollo client documentation again. Let's click on the mutations section. And we can see that there is this use mutation hook. So let's go and get that. And turns out, hey, we've already got some code for mutation. So let's go and grab that out of localhost 4000 again. And we're going to use our GQL thing, but this time we're going to call it post message. But here's a problem, right? So we don't want to go and always send, Jack goodbye. That doesn't make any sense, right? So we need to replace that with a value. So in this case, we're going to say that user is going to be $user and content is going to be $content. Well, where does it get that? Well, that's going to come in from the variables. And we define those right at the top. So you can say mutation, and then in parentheses, $user is a string, and $content is a string. And that will tell GraphQL to expect that there will be variables named user and content, and they're required because of the exclamation point. And then it's going to map that to the fields, user and content, on that post message. And you can also see that kind of over in the documentation over here. They use add to do, and that's going to take a type as a string. So let's look down the documentation a little bit. We get back an array, and the first item is this add to do, which is actually going to do the work. But we also give the query. Makes sense. Let's go put it into our code. So we're going to call it post message. And then we're going to use mutation and give it post message. So how do we invoke that? Well, you give it an object, and that object has variables as a key, and then the variables you want. So let's go drop that in there. Post message, and then within that, variables, and we just send the state, right? Because user and content match up. Awesome. Let's go try it out. I'm going to hit send, and the content disappears. That's good. Let's refresh now. And excellent. Okay, so it's working. That's good. But the fact that it didn't appear is not great, right? That's not great UI. So let's go and fix that. So if we go back to queries, you scroll down a little bit, we'll see that there's an option for polling. So all we need to do is add in this poll interval on our query. So let's go back up here to messages and then just add in an options object that says poll interval is 500. Sure, why not? That sounds good. And that basically means that every 500 milliseconds, we're going to refetch that query. So let's type in this one, and boom, there we go. Nice. But let's have a look over at our network inspector and see the damage that we have wrought. Look at that. Okay, so that's now every 500 milliseconds, we're making another query. And that's probably not great. Okay, we've got our client running. That's great, but it's doing this polling thing like every 500 milliseconds, and that's just inefficient. I mean, if there's no messages waiting for you, then you're just hitting the server every 500 milliseconds for no reason, which even if you get the protocol down and you're not sending all that much data, it's still a lot of overhead, and it's still a lot of API requests to the server that are there for no reason. So How are we going to fix this? We're going to use the subscription system built into the GraphQL standard and create a WebSocket connection between the client and the server. And it's just really cool. Let's go check out in the code how that's done. To start changing out the server so that it's a subscriptions model, we're going to first stop the server. And then we're going to bring in PubSub from GraphQL Yoga. And that's a publish subscribe handler for this GraphQL system. And then we're going to define a new type. And that type is subscription. It's just like query and mutation. It's a special type. And it's going to have the same thing. You can subscribe to messages. And in that subscription, and this is probably the most complicated code we're going to do here, we're going to have a subscribe function that's going to take a parent args, and then it's going to take the context, which is going to contain a PubSub object that we haven't created yet. So let's go create that. We're going to create PubSub by just saying we want a new PubSub. And we're going to add that in as context. So the first thing we need to do is define a new random channel. So we'll just go use math random, and it's going to return 0 dot something, some random number. So we'll slice off the 0 dot, and we'll just get the number, and it's going to give us a nice little random string there. And then we're going to return effectively the PubSub async iterator for this channel. So in addition to that, we also need to keep a persistent list of who's actually subscribing, who's on all these channels. So we're going to call that subscribers. And then we're going to have a new function called onMessagesUpdate, which allows us to add a new subscriber to this list of subscribers. So we'll call that onMessagesUpdate, and it'll take a function, which is our subscriber callback, and we'll just push it onto our list of subscribers. And so the first thing we need to do is say, oh, cool, all right, you've shown up, you've asked for a subscription on messages, so we will go and add you to that. So go and give it the function, and that callback is then going to use PubSub publish on that channel to send you a message. Hey, here's the new messages. So we'll use channel, and then we'll give it the content of messages. But we'll also be really nice. We will set a timeout so that it automatically sends it the first time when you start publishing. So we'll do set timeout, and then we'll give it exactly that same callback, and then we'll do it on 0, which means on the next tick, we're going to go send you that data. You've subscribed, here's the data, boom, there you go. You don't have to wait for somebody to actually go and post a message in order for you to see the new messages. Now there's one thing left to do. So we need to go over here to the mutation, and we need to alert the system when a new set of messages is out there. So the way that we do that is we iterate over subscribers, and then for each one of those, we just call that callback. There you go. So let's start up our server. All right, so now we're going to try this out. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to post a message. Cool. And then we're going to create a new tab where we basically create our subscriptions. We go create a subscription. Here's messages. We want ID and username, and hit play. And now right away, we see what we just posted, right? We see that we posted Jack goodbye. Let's go over to post message again. We'll change that out to hello. And now GraphQL is automatically showing the new content because we're subscribed, which is really cool. So now we know this is going to work if we can make the client sing this song. All right, so we know through our GraphQL UI that we can speak subscriptions between the client and the server, which is great. And of course, now we need to go make our UI go and do that. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about how WebSockets actually work. So a WebSocket, when a client requests a WebSocket connection to a server, what actually happens is the first thing that happens is we do an HTTP connection, just the standard HTTP request. But as part of it, we say, hey, we want an upgrade. And if the server can support that, then it flips around the connection to be this live, continuous connection between the server and the client. And that allows then the GraphQL protocol, which sits on top of this, to accept incoming data from the server when subscriptions are updated, which is really cool. All right, so let's go try it out on the client and see how this is actually going to work in our React app. So how do we make the UI now do that subscription? So go back over to client and go over into subscriptions. And then our handy documentation also talks about how to do the client side. So first thing we need to do is add in the subscriptions transport WS library. So let's go and yarn add that. And the next thing you need to do is change out our link. So let's go and bring in this import statement, which is going to bring in WebSocket link. And then we got to create one. So we'll call this link. And then instead of localhost 5000, we're going to say it's on localhost 4000 because that's where our server is. And now we'll add the link to the client. And let's start it up. All right, looks pretty good. All right, so it's working, which is good, but I don't think that we're using that subscription yet because we're just still using queries. So our queries are now running over the WebSockets, which is really interesting. So let's do use subscription instead of use query. And we'll say subscription instead of query. And then we'll change out use query to use subscription. And we'll get rid of that polling. We no longer need to poll. Yay! Okay. And let's type in something. Hey, and it works right away. That is really cool. And you can see it's instantaneous. Boom. I hit it, and it's done. No problem. So let's create another window and just kind of put it down to the side there. And now you can see how instantaneous it is. I've got Sally and she says something and it just instantaneously pops up on both sides. And we can even go back to our Graphyql interface and show that it's also subscribed. It's like another chat client. It just happens to be showing JSON. How cool is that? All right, so we've got our efficient UI that uses WebSockets and only gets data as it's needed, which is awesome. But it wouldn't be like me to leave it there. So we're going to kick it up a notch by going and using Webpack 5's Module Federation technology to share this chat component with another application. So Module Federation is really interesting. If you're in the kind of medium to very large business context, you might be using what's called a microsite architecture, which means that your site is actually composed of a bunch of smaller apps. And in that model, sharing code can be a little problematic. So Module Federation allows you to take parts and pieces of your application and share them directly out of your app, which is really exciting. And it's a live sharing system. So that means that when we update the chat mechanism that we have in the current client app, it's going to automatically update in the new app that's consuming it, which is really neat. All right, let's go jump into the code and try it out. Okay, so now we want to go and integrate this thing into another application. We want to have yet another app. So let's go create another terminal in our Chatomatic. And we're going to use the exact same dgit as before, but this time we're going to call it homepage. So our homepage is going to have a chat. I'm guessing this current chat client may be on a customer support page. Who knows? So we'll go into homepage, change out the package name, and we'll go and change out the Webpack Config. So first we want to be on 8081. And then we're going to start messing around with our Module Federation plugin. And so we'll call this current app Home by changing name and also the library name. And that's all we need to do. We're a consumer. Home is going to consume client's chat. So now let's go and tweak the UI a little bit. We'll go over to the app on this one, and we'll just go create some simple stuff. We'll add in our shards library. Bring in the CSS for that. Bring in the container. Make a couple paragraph tags. Make an H1 that says chat. And then I'm going to put in a placeholder. Essentially, this is where the chat one is supposed to go. And then we're going to go bring in lorem ipsum, just to make it, so we can visually see that there's a difference between these two things. And we'll start that up. Nice. Okay. So pretty standard. Got a little placeholder in here. And now I've got that chat window here thing. So that's what we want to replace with the chat. So how are we going to do that? We need to get the chat code from another app entirely. So now let's go over to the original client app and modify its Webpack config. So we're going to go down into the Module Federation plugin. And we're going to say that this is now the chat app. And we're going to expose our chat component. And the way that we do that was we add a new key to exposes called ./chat. And then we give it the source that we want to expose. So in that case, that's the whole chat component. And that includes all kinds of stuff. It includes Apollo provider and all of that. It's a fairly heavyweight component. Now we need to restart that. Cool, looking good. But now what this has done is it's invisibly added this new file called remoteentry.js. And that's a manifest of everything that 8080 chat client app is exposing to the outside world. So it looks like this. And you can see it's got ./chat in there, and it's got source chat. So it pretty much has what we've asked it to put out there. So let's go and grab that URL. And now we're going to go add that to the index page of the home page. Right in the head, we're just going to bring that in. Script source, remote entry. And we're going to import that component just like this. We're going to just say import chat from chat, which is the remote name of the client, and then chat, which is what we said in exposes. And bring it in here, just drop it in there, just like that. Just like we did in app.jsx in the client app. And now we can see that we got an error. Chat is not found. Okay. So what we need to do is modify the Webpack config to basically say, oh, there is this chat out there. So let's go and modify that Module Federation plugin to say that we have a remote for chat. So just go tweak this remotes key and just add a chat. Chat is chat. Start it up again. And there it is. Now we're importing chat as a React component. This is not an iframe. It's not anything like that. It is straight up the React code from the other application, automatically brought in live at runtime and brought into our app and run. And it works. So let's go make a change over on client, which is still running, to go and tweak that send button because it's not taking up the available space. So let's go down here to the send button and make it width 100%. And we go over to 8080, we can see that it's changed right away because of a live reload. But 8081 doesn't know that it's changed. So if I go back over to 8081, which is our homepage, and I hit refresh, boom, it's updated. Right, so we're looking at live code. Let's try it again, just for giggles. Let's go change that green to like a blue, big old blue. All right, boom, big old blue, just like that. Kind of gaudy, but okay. Let's go see on 8081. I hit refresh, and we get the new code with the new big blue. Nice, gorgeous. Module Federation is super cool. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed making it. I hope you learned something new, maybe something about GraphQL, GraphQL Subscriptions, or this really cool Module Federation system, which I'm really excited about. I actually wrote a book on it. And if you have any questions, be sure to put those in the comment section down below. I'll be watching. If you like the video, hit that like button. If you really like the video, go to my channel, which is also in the description, and check out some more videos just kind of like this. And in the meantime, as I always like to say at the end of my videos, be happy, be healthy, and be safe.